I didn't pay him to say all that, really. I'd like to thank Eastern Washington University again for for inviting me, as well as the Women's Studies program. Thank you for offering me space, as well as camp and Chicana education program. This is wonderful. I'm glad that I was able to participate in this wonderful event. Okay. And so, for those of you who were able to participate in yesterday's event, I spoke briefly about some of my struggles with the educational system, being a migrant farm worker, living in a rural area, and some of those obstacles that I had to endure and kind of overcome. And it wasn't so much that I wanted to talk about, you know, I'm not a strong believer in pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't necessarily believe in meritocracy. But that was more, my narrative that I shared yesterday was more of a way to talk to the high school students and let them know that, you know, we as a people have been continually defined as deficient, and I want to share that it is time that we redefine ourselves. And so the talk that I'll be giving today is along those lines, but in terms of specifically looking at language. Okay, so let me begin. So I'm going to begin a little with a little bit of a narrative that my grandmother gave to me, or told me in 2004. She says, "Yo sé cómo pasó cuando perdimos nuestro lenguaje. La maestra de Tomato le dijo a María que él no podía entrar a la escuela sin hablar inglés. Yo quería que mis nietos tuvieran una vida mejor de los labores y pues empezamos a hablar inglés. Nadie nos ayudaron a hablar inglés. Aprendimos solitos." She says, "I know what happened when we lost our language. Tomato's teacher told Maria that he couldn't go to school until he spoke English. I wanted my grandchildren to have a better life than the fields, and well, we started speaking in English. Nobody helped us. We learned on our own." My paternal grandmother clearly articulated the harsh consequences required in gaining rural Midwestern schools access and subsequent class mobility. Essentially, for Spanish-speaking Chicanas, entrance into school doors required that they had to learn English quickly and discreetly with Spanish at home. These wise, although formally quote-unquote uneducated women knew that having a quote-unquote formal education could keep their children and future grandchildren from toiling in the fields from sunup to sundown. As such, during the 1960s, my grandparents made the decision to end their migratory work in hopes of securing educational opportunities and eventual economic stability. Consequently, their annual migration from South Texas to mid-Michigan ended, thereby restricting continued connections to their heritage language. While sitting with my paternal grandmother, Delfina, she spoke candidly about those first years in El Norte, as Michigan was referred to by the regional migrant families. In fact, she remembers the exact date that English became a necessity for survival in her family's new community. It was evident that remembering those first years meant recalling the harsh experiences with simultaneous bitterness, powerlessness, and yet hopeful that the sacrifice would bear economic and social opportunities for her extended family. According to my grandmother, her first child, whose name was Tomas, but we affectionately named him, who's known as Tomato, due to his round, blush red cheeks, entered school as a monolingual Spanish speaker. Upon his matriculation, the white teachers at the rural Michigan school did not know how to communicate with him, and he was promptly sent home with strict instructions not to return until he spoke English. Although this is illegal today, and we'll see how long that lasts, it was common practice in America's heartland during the early 70s. Since we were the only family at that time in this particular community who spoke a language other than English, my family had to learn the dominant language without support from the school's faculty or Anglo-American community members. The onset of our family's educational experiences mandated English proficiency without any assistance or support from the surrounding rural Midwestern community teachers or pedagogical materials. However, as each subsequent generation developed their English language skills, and we are now in fourth generation, we've also had to struggle to maintain the remnants of a heritage language. 30 years after Tomas walked into his classroom, I entered the ivory towers of academia as a graduate student. It was within these walls that I began to reflect upon my family's experiences of struggles and their efforts to become members of a rural Anglo-American community. What surfaced during this time of contemplation was a correlation to the community's acceptance of my own family and our English language proficiency. During graduate school, I came to realize how my English comprehension and fluency gave me the ability or the potential to maneuver through the Anglo-controlled or dominated educational system, whereas my limited Spanish-speaking abilities gave me the language to actively engage within my community's dialogue. I began to understand that although English was the language of power, my heritage language offered knowledge systems that English could not. Spanish served as the key into my community's discourse, by opening spaces where our heritage language told stories of family members we have never met, my grandmother's childhood in New Mexico, or my father fighting off La Lechuza one evening after a late night out with friends. The imagery could never truly encapsulate any other language than ours. However, the necessity for English fluency continually trumped the need to maintain Spanish. In the eyes of the educational system, as exemplified in our current anti-immigrant legislation that is systematically dismantling bilingual programs across the nation and continues to delegitimize heritage languages, English is the only language of importance. It is a symbol of commerce, value, and capital, while any other language is inferior. It is from this perspective that I approach my research. My presentation this afternoon will outline the efforts of Mexicano migrant farm workers in northern Michigan to maintain their cultural and language despite the dominant society's efforts to strip them from the racially stigmatized community. Drawing upon auto-ethnographic material as well as an additional case study, I will discuss how one particular community in northwestern Michigan has used Spanish as a way to prepare their children for holistic education, one that integrates equally both knowledge systems created by the community itself and by the U.S. educational system. As such, my primary focus is on rural Michigan, not only because that is the place of my birth and the community I know most intimately, but also because this is where thousands of migrant workers continue to work hidden from the eyes of their Anglo neighbors. The community's inconspicuous lifestyle is not an easy feat, considering over 30,000 workers arrive annually in Michigan. Their labor sustains the Midwestern state's second largest economy, which is agriculture, yet they are hidden from the larger community's eyes. Before I begin the narrative, I would like to outline the theoretical framework utilized, followed by a brief description of the participants, which will then be preceded by my narrative. Latino critical race theory functions as a theoretical framework for this project and is closely aligned to critical race theory. Both theories were born out of a legal discourse in an attempt to critically confront the dominant discourses surrounding the oppressive facets of society in hopes of establishing equitable and democratic alternative. Both LAT-CRIT and CRT recognize the legitimate purpose of experiential knowledge and how these epistemologies are crucial in understanding the inequalities that endured by people of color. Moreover, LAT-CRIT understands the complex nature of the Latino community and examines oppression through the auspices of race, language, immigration status, ethnicity, culture, identity, gender, and phenotype, to name only a few of the dominant foci. I evoke LAT-CRIT as my framework for its multi-dimensional perspective is particularly important to the migrant farmer community in the upper Midwest. As such, LAT-CRIT challenges the dominant discourse on race and racism, while simultaneously examining how educational theory and practices are used to subordinate and marginalize Latino students and families. Tara Yoso and Danny Solisano succinctly adapt the multi-authored text LAT-CRIT primer to create the following definition of LAT-CRIT theory in education. They write that, quote, "A LAT-CRIT theory in education is a framework that can be used to theorize and examine the ways in which race and racism explicitly and implicitly impact on the educational structures, process, and discourses that affect people of color, generally and Latinos specifically."